Hello everybody, welcome to 2020 International Women's Day. We're definitely living in interesting times. The show today is going to look at authoritarian regimes and feminist resistance. We have three great guests here today to talk about these issues, and I would like each of them to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about themselves and the kind of issues that they work on. So Rosamond, I will start with you.
I'm Rosamond S. and I'm an associate professor at Brooklyn College, but I also work on issues around sexual minorities in the Caribbean, in Africa, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about the situation in the US as well as resistance in the US and in the global South.
Yes, I'm Binalakshmi Nepram, founder, director of the Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network, and also just founded the Global Alliance of Indigenous People, Gender Justice and Peace. I come from the area of Manipur in northeast of India, and today I'll be talking on the issue of the rise of authoritarian regimes in India and how, starting from indigenous women and women from all over the country, there is a massive resistance going on right now as we speak.
Great, thank you. María Luisa.
María Luisa Mendonça. I'm with the Network for Social Justice and Human Rights in Brazil, and I'm currently a visiting scholar at the CUNY Graduate Center. And I work on rural issues, indigenous rights, land rights, and with the dramatic situation that is happening in Brazil, also with an authoritarian regime that is violating basic rights. I think it's very important to build solidarity, to build international solidarity. So I'm glad to be here today.
I'm very happy. And I'm Radhika Balakrishnan. I teach women's and gender and sexuality studies at Rutgers University, and also the faculty director of the Center for Women's Global Leadership. I'm an economist by training and do work on feminist economics. So on the taping of the show, President Trump just left India, was welcomed to a huge rally in Delhi. Bolsonaro from Brazil, President Bolsonaro from Brazil, has met with Trump. Prime Minister Modi came to the US in 2019 to another huge rally in Texas where 50,000 people came, and it was called Howdy Modi. And so all of these people are getting together and talking about certain things that they're doing. And part of what we want to do in the show is to really look at what these authoritarian regimes are, what they're doing, how they're doing it, and really look at the feminist resistance that is taking place around the world, and what kind of feminist resistance do we need moving forward, and what are the kind of global conversations that we need to have in order to think about these regimes as something to dismantle and unpack so that we know which way to go. So what I want to do to start with is really to have each of our speakers talk about the countries that they're working on and working in, and give a little bit of a history of where we are and how we got here. So I want to start with you to talk about India and kind of, give us a little history of where we are now, what the issues are, and I'd say you don't even have to talk about the resistance now, just sort of lay it out, what's happening in terms of the authoritarian regimes.
Yeah. First of all, as we speak right now, there are riots, communal riots going on in Delhi. But the past 42 hours, there have been 10 killed and over 150 injured in India's capital, New Delhi, on the eve and at the current visit of President Trump's visit on the invite of Prime Minister Modi. So it's a very, very tense time, and our hearts and prayers lie with those families and who have been absolutely gripped into the state of violence. So this is one of the most difficult times in the history of India, deemed as the world's largest democracy. But what we are seeing since the rise of 2014, and of course India is a democracy like United States and many other democracies. We as citizens, whoever comes to power, we are asking, please do good governance. But as an Indian citizen born and grew up in that area, what I realize, I've lived and worked in Delhi for almost a decade too, what we are seeing in India right now is unprecedented in the history of independent India, in which the targeting of minorities is happening. Muslims, Dalits, communities, feminist groups, so all of this, yeah.
Just talk about who the Prime Minister is and what party he comes from, because the audience might not know.
Yes. So the Prime Minister of India is Prime Minister Modi, and he comes from the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the current ruling party of India. And right now what is the disturbing thing is they form their basis from a group called the RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, who actually they are the same people who killed Mahatma Gandhi. So we are now in the grip of the most right-wing authoritarian regime in India currently. And there are 4 different strains you can see what's happening in India. First of all, what I call corporate, what is known as corporatized democracy, in which in 2014 we saw a lot of corporates supporting Prime Minister Modi rise to power, number 1. Number 2, what we also saw was using religion, So Hinduism is supposed to be a way of life. The yoga was born in India. It's a byproduct of Hinduism, but in the land of yoga, we do not have any peace right now. And third, in terms of patriarchal mindsets and the neoliberal policy, which is now becoming a part of a rule, which are what I call playbook of authoritarian regime, is happening in India right now. So this is the worry that the current country is facing, and we as women's groups, and particularly indigenous women group and other minority groups, are absolutely petrified by what's happening, but we are also massive resistance, which I'll talk in the next part. Yeah.
Right. Thanks. María Luisa?
Yes, the situation in Brazil is very similar, right? Like India, we are a so-called developing country that in the last few decades we had successful governments. The Workers' Party had won 4 consecutive presidential elections and was implementing policies that were dealing with problems such as unemployment, poverty, and inequality. And the right-wing forces could not win elections for over a decade in Brazil. So in 2016, we had a coup, a parliamentary coup against President Dilma Rousseff, who was re-elected at that time. When she was re-elected, the unemployment rate was 4%, and now it's 15%. So what happened was that there was a speculative attack that generated an economic crisis in Brazil, and that was a way for the right wing to justify a parliamentary coup against an elected president, President Dilma, that also had, of course, a sexist element to it, right? Because she was the first woman president in Brazil. So they invented a technical issue, and most people don't even understand why she was impeached, because the whole discourse was about corruption, but actually there was no case of corruption against her. It was a technical budgetary formula that other previous presidents used to deal with the budget, with the national budget. So they, created this story to impeach her. And then after that, you had a vacuum, a political vacuum, because after a coup, all the institutions suffered. The judiciary, the parliament in Brazil. And then when we had the elections last year, also they created a case against former President Lula, who was the most popular politician in Brazil, even when he was in jail. So again, there was no evidence against him, but he was put in jail anyway, and that opened the space for a far-right candidate like Bolsonaro. At the same time, you had three major forces. We had all mainstream media that supported the coup. And so in Brazil, it's almost like you only have Fox News. So all the corporate media are right-wing media. And then you have the evangelical churches that played the key role also. And then with the help of Cambridge Analytica, Steve Bannon, you had the huge Bolsonaro organized a huge fake news campaign on social media with robots, to influence how people would vote in the elections. So it's not like all Brazilians went crazy and elected this far-right fascist candidate. We have to understand what are the strategies of the far-right globally today to be able to resist.
I think that's a great lead into what happened in the U.S.
Exactly. I think there's so much overlap, right? And it's the same thing that sometimes we will demonize people who voted for the current president of the United States, but again, it was playing on people's fears, right? Whether those fears were that as white people they were being displaced from the power they were used to having, or the idea that they could aspire to the kind of wealth that the current president has. All of this is what kind of helped lead to the election of the current president. And now, the thing about authoritarian regimes is that we're being attacked on all fronts. And so it is exhausting. And I feel like that is actually part of the strategy, right? And so we have the very life-threatening attacks on immigrants, right? And the putting people into cages, dividing up families, which is something that we saw at the very founding of this country with indigenous people. We see the attacks on queer people, right? The attempts to tell people where they can go to the bathroom, the suggestion that perhaps we will not have same-sex marriage anymore. You see the rhetoric that the president is using, that even if there are not exact laws that are being passed that are explicitly racist or sexist, that the rhetoric opens the door for both officials and vigilantes, regular everyday people, to commit acts against women, people of color, Muslims, immigrants, etc. And so, and then of course we have the attacks on the environment. Right, as well. We have the pipelines that are going through. We have vast areas, acres, hundreds of acres of formerly parkland that was protected that has now been opened up to development. And so it's overwhelming, and yet we still have to have the resistance, right? And I think we have to have people mobilizing in different areas, intersecting with each other and communicating with each other.
So just to add to her point, some of the elements of authoritarian regime, creating fear, dividing people, changing our histories, like Indian textbooks have been rewritten to suit the authoritarian's agenda, and some of the things of, the fear is absolutely relevant. And again, othering, for example, here in the United States, it's about, the building the wall and they are, whatever. And in India, it's about the Muslims, it's about the indigenous communities who do not, is the idea of India, So if he or she is a Hindu, then you are a real Indian. So as an indigenous person, that's a tussle that we're having. Our history of 45 million indigenous people in the Northeast is not in the textbooks of India. And currently, they are now using laws, Citizenship Amendment Act, which is leading to the burning in Delhi as well as Shaheen Bagh. All these are coming. They're also not just creating fear, using the media, creating fake news, but they are also imposing laws, the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens, in which our citizenship is now a question mark. So this is what is it.
I mean, I'll jump in, but you can also explain. But for people who don't know, the National Registry is an attempt to register every person in India as a citizen, right?
I will explain.
Yeah, you explain it.
So it started in my region, in the indigenous area of Assam. And it was meant, the indigenous people felt that India does not recognize indigenous people. But the people of Assam said, we will be inundated, we will be like minorities, or we'll be driven out. So the people of Assam asked the government of India to have a certain kind of regulation so that there is safety under the UN Indigenous Peoples' Rights. They wanted this. But what the Modi government has turned, they call it National Register of Citizens. It started in Assam in northeast of India, in which they started saying, show your documents from 1971 that your forefathers belong to this country. If you are not, cannot show it, then you are not an Indian citizen. So 1.9 million people, I repeat, 1.9 million people are now out of the National Register of Citizens only in one state. And the BJP is using it to target in other parts of India, saying we did it in Assam, now we will do in other parts of India. The second is the Citizenship Amendment Act, which is really serious, which is a violation of Indian Constitution itself and a violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What does this act say? It says that anyone from the neighboring countries of Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, who belong to Hindu faith and other minority religion, but basically Hindu faith, they can come to India and then they can get automatic citizenship. They can get it. But if you are a Muslim, if you are indigenous, if you are other communities which is not, you cannot become an Indian citizen, which is a basic violation which the UN has called it as a discriminatory racial act. This is why India is burning right now. It started in my region, now it's burning all over because we have been protesting against this act since the act was first tabled in 2016, 2 years after Modi came to power. And we saw what Modi did in Kashmir. So these are a series of authoritarian repressive measures where they took out Article 370 from Kashmir and made it into literally, it was like a rape of Kashmir, literally. That gave sovereignty to Kashmiri people. Modi took it away. And then they put it this martial. And why they are doing the citizenship law? You see, it is to preserve the vote bank of India's right-wing political party. Because 20 million are supposed to gain citizenship in India, 20 million Hindus. This is going to be, BJP wants to be in power for the next 50 years. This is the modus operandi which is happening in India right now. Yeah.
I want to go to Brazil and talk about, in terms of tactics, right, and what they're trying to do. What is Bolsonaro's regime's tactics, and what do you think is the end goal? Here it's BJP ruling forever, the Hindu nation, the oppression of minorities, especially Muslims and indigenous people. It's very clear. What is it in Brazil with Bolsonaro?
Yeah, it's very similar also in terms of attacking democracy in several fronts, right? So as activists, we look at the news every day and it's like every day is, 10 bad news, 10 different things that he's doing in terms of policy and rhetoric. So, it's just dismantling democracy very fast, so people get paralyzed and don't know what to do, right? It's the shock doctrine, right? Mm-hmm. That you don't know what to do. So in several areas, for example, dismantling public education, changing textbooks, erasing, for example, the history of the military dictatorship. He's putting hundreds of military personnel in key governmental positions in all kinds of offices, from the indigenous institutions that deal with indigenous lands, to education, healthcare. So he's dismantling all kinds of social programs in terms of that give people a sense of of social protection. Brazil is one of the most unequal countries in the world in terms of economics and also land rights. And of course, he's giving a green light for illegal loggers, mining and the destruction of the Amazon. So, some of the things that he's discussing recently is allowing indigenous mining in indigenous lands, for example, and dismantling also protection for violence against women. For example, in public hospitals, when a woman goes to a hospital and has a case of rape, for example, automatically the hospital, the doctor needs to report and protect the woman. So, this is no longer the case. For example, protection against children, against LGBT people. So you see an increased violence on the streets against minorities. Also, he is changing gun laws to allow selling of guns, which the number of people killed by guns in Brazil is like 40,000 a year, is already very high. So this, of course, would increase domestic violence, which is also reaching very high numbers in terms of the historical data. So all the ministers that were created in the previous government to protect human rights, women's rights, indigenous rights, they are dismantling all these institutions. He got rid of the labor minister. We don't have
a labor minister,
labor minister anymore. So all kinds of labor protection, social security, retirement plans. He wants to privatize the public retirement system, like the social security system, to benefit, of course, banks, financial corporations. So it's a combination of fascist policies and neoliberal economic policies. So let's say the traditional conservative parties ended up embracing fascism, to implement those neoliberal economic policies.
Yeah, and I'd say even more than neoliberal economic policies. I think it's dismantling, so much more than what are traditional neoliberal policies, right?
Yeah,
It's really any kind of regulatory thing that the government has been, like protecting indigenous land or the environment, and because you could have those and have some neoliberal policy. This is just on steroids. It's going on steroids. I feel like every time she talks about Brazil, I look at you because it's just so similar to what's happening in the U.S. It's just like all of the things that she's talking about.
We have some people who some important positions in the government, dozens of them that have not been filled. We have many of them where there are acting people, and then he fires them because it's very easy to fire someone who hasn't been officially approved to be put in the position. And then when we do have people in the positions, they are either not qualified or they are actively against the very existence, for instance, of environmental policies, right? And so definitely very similar there. And the notion of economic insecurity, something that I would love to hear you talk about as an economist, Radhika, because in all of our countries, there is this rhetoric of economic success. Right, and what some people say in the U.S. is that, well, yes, there's low unemployment because everybody has 3 jobs, because everybody's fighting so hard just to survive that they're driving for Uber and they're working at a fast food joint and they're taking care of children informally. But on paper, it appears that it's an economic success. So I don't know if you want to talk about that.
The one thing I wanted to add to that is that in the U.S., for example, there's some increase in employment, but it really is a legacy of Obama's policies. It's now starting to go down with the kind of economic policies that Trump has done. But you're completely right. What you're seeing is that the wages have gone, the real wage has been stagnant, even though productivity has gone up. And so people are having to have 2-3 jobs in order to maintain their same family. And that insecurity is also, I think, what got him elected. Right, because it's not like the Democratic Party was doing some non-neoliberal policy, right? And so it was sort of like, what is the response to high levels of insecurity and poverty and inequality. I mean, inequality in the world is the highest it's ever been since the 1920s, anywhere in the world, all three countries, you know. India has the highest unemployment rate since independence. Brazil, the unemployment rate has gone up. And so when we live in insecure times, then do you either go to a progressive agenda and try and figure out how to change that, or you go to a fascist agenda because it's easier to blame that person for the reason why you don't have a job, or you know, it's because that person got too much, rather than understanding that it's a systemic issue and that we need to change the system, and that's a little bit more complicated.
Can we jump in? Because I have never lived in America. I came here and three things hurts me when I see what is happening here. First is the fact that students in America are burdened with student loans.
Absolutely.
India is a poorer country with 300 plus million poor. We never get into debt because we want to learn something. Okay, how educate. Number two, healthcare, and the number of people that I've seen who are with mental health issues. It hurts me as a human being, and this has not happened. And under Trump's told in India the economy is growing too in his visit, but guess what? It's only 10% of the top who are benefiting from this. Absolutely. Ordinary Americans are not benefiting from this. Another thing which Maria, which you mentioned, one of the traits of authoritarian regime is having these patriarchal values, reinforcing it, and having this toxic masculine policies. All right, and I'll explain.
Totally.
And I'll explain.
Totally.
Militarization, which you mentioned. Very interestingly, President Trump said, we're going to sell to India 3 billion weaponry of weapons. This is it. And absolutely, India is the world's second largest importer of military weaponry in the whole world, which is just Saudi Arabia, and then India follows. And how we are in gender index, 108th in the global gender index. Look at this dichotomy. As a woman scholar and activist from my region, and also I specialize in disarmament issues. So whenever I see this dichotomy, if you think India is a land of Gandhi, land of yoga, please stop for a moment. 12 Indians are shot dead every day because of gun violence. 40 million firearms in India. There's a lot of things going on, and militarization is a trait of authoritarian regime. Absolutely. This whole thing. So this is one thing which I really want to jump in when you were sharing about gun violence. And this is something that we will have to collectively respond as women's groups and feminist groups. Yeah.
Well, one strategy also that Bolsonaro uses is attacking journalists.
Yeah. I was gonna jump on. Exactly. But before you go to the journalists,
very similar to Trump.
And India. But before you get to that, because I actually want to unpack that a little bit, I want to stay on the toxic masculinity for a bit longer, right? Because that's something all three of them have so much in common, right? With Prime Minister Modi, how big his chest is, right?
56-inch chest.
That was a big thing, you know, and Trump, like, I'm the, you know, I mean, he is a macho, sexist, you know, and even though the whole world's heard him talk about what he did to women, he got in. Bolsonaro, the same thing, right? Homophobic. Didn't he say something like, you know, he would kill his son if he was gay, or you know, that he would rather kill his son than accept a gay. So there's a homophobic, misogynist, sexist, you know, but macho, real toxic masculinity in all of them. And we don't have Philippines here, but Duarte as well, right? It's that kind of similarity between all of these leaders. So I just wanted us to sit on that for just one more, you know, to see what you have to say.
And it shows you some of the contradictions, right? Because the current president of the United States, he is supposedly a Christian, right? And is appealing also to these evangelicals. And yet his behavior in terms of his multiple marriages, his avowed affairs, his patronizing of sex workers, none of that aligns with the supposed values, right? And so I think that that's one of the things that we can do to help dismantle the ideology of authoritarianism, is point out where it's contradictory.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. And Indian Prime Minister Modi has a wife, but he has abandoned her. So it's like, what do we say of a kind of So he's seen projected as a strong man of India who's going to lead India into like kind of another world, you know. So this whole machoism is so much prevalent that as a woman from India, it sickens me. And the whole way in which the military is projected, you know, everything is so militarized that if you talk against army, you are considered anti-national. What we are doing in our region, when we ask for the removal of a martial law, we're asking for deepening of democracy. Yeah. We love India like many other Indians, but for saying this, you are portrayed as this activist who is, always yelling, shouting, screaming, useless, all kind. Again, the way in which feminists and feminist groups have been reduced to being a kind which is anti-national to the idea of India is so much ingrained. And talking about media, the media in India is totally divided. We have an amazing media who are fighting for this secular India, but there are a lot of medias who are going to television studios, holding assault rifles in arms bazaars, you know. And it's insane. This is just a media who's supposed to be the fourth estate, to be independent and give a reasoning for society to function. But no, it's not happening. So this selling out is going at multiple levels, which we have to and continue to strongly resist.
I mean, I think that what I was saying about journalists has to do with that toxic masculinity as well, because he's just a few days ago attacked, a journalist was asking him a question, a woman journalist, and he responded saying that if she wanted to have sex with him, you know, he said something like that. It's difficult to translate because he uses slang. Another man journalist asked him a question. He asked, "Oh, you look like you were gay." So he's attacking the media using that, you know, those things. And also, you know, he had also 3 previous marriages. Wow. You know, it's like, you know, an old guy with a young woman, very similar type of persona. And also, he has close connections with private militia groups, paramilitary groups. And the new investigation about the killing of Councilwoman Marielle Franco from Rio shows close connections between Bolsonaro and the 2 men who are part of a militia group that had relatives working in his son's office, Bolsonaro's son's office, and one of them is Bolsonaro's neighbor. Actually, they live in a luxurious condominium, and how come a former police officer can live in that place next to the president? So now, you know, there are all these things coming up, these investigations connecting him with the militia groups. So what we have is, you're right, it's not like the traditional neoliberal parties, conservative parties. Is an extreme group of people connected with even the most radical sector of the military, you know, which are these paramilitary militias that are involved with drug trafficking, with sales of arms. And now the last thing he did, he dismantled the agency that regulated gasoline, you know, to make sure the gasoline was not altered, because that's also a key source of funding for these illegal militia groups, right? Contraband of gasolines, of arms, drugs. So this is, you know, who we have in power in Brazil now.
And I think it's in the U.S. It's that, I mean, I love blaming the economy for, or, you know, a certain kind of economic policy for all the evils, but this one, it's you know, it's right-wing ideology that is connected. I'm not saying, you know, they're suddenly, you know, doing socialist policies and right-wing democracy, but this one is really that right-wing ideology. You know, evangelicals in the U.S., the Hindu right in India, Brazil's right-wing, long history from before coming back. But I think what I want to do for the remaining time is really spend a little bit time talking about the resistance, because we want to talk about the feminist resistance. What is the feminist resistance, and where is it happening? So I'm going to start with you this time.
Well, you know, we've been talking about some things that are upsetting and depressing, but the resistance is actually really exciting.
Yeah.
You know, and everyone will have heard of Black Lives Matter, which was founded by a group of people, but that people included feminists, feminists who were women and feminists who were men. It included queer women. And out of Black Lives Matter, we now have, with the street protests, we now have the organization Movement for Black Lives that is actually addressing policy and so on. And what's fascinating is that there are actually thousands of people involved. There's data for Black lives, which is mathematicians and statisticians. We have law for Black lives. We have archives for Black lives, which is librarians and archivists. And so all of these people, they're doing work that is both explicit, but they're also kind of doing work that's not, that you won't be able to kind of find on the internet, where they're talking to each other and saying, well, this is how we can organize the library to make sure that information is available to people. And so I think that's one of the really exciting things that's happening. And also the protests that were happening in Puerto Rico, right? Which I found very inspiring, where people came out into the street, and a lot of women, and everything from, you know, traditional kind of signs to dancing in front of the Capitol, women dancing the pareo, which is a particular kind of dance in front of the Capitol, to protest and say, we're not going to put up with the corruption anymore. But again, in addition to the street protests, you have people thoughtfully and strategically organizing in the absence of a responsible government to get physical materials, food, clothing to people in the wake of the earthquakes in Puerto Rico. So what's exciting to me is that you have both aspects. You have the street protests, but then you also have strategy and politics and behind the scenes and real support for people.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we know all over India there are protests from the south to the north.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we are living in a time where 68 million people are displaced, are in refugee camps because of these dictatorial authoritarian regimes. And their hunger for power is driving. There are 4 million people in my region in the Northeast which are internally displaced, which the world doesn't know. So there are these massive movements going on, which is really painful, but at the same time, there is so important, critical time in not just our history, global history, to galvanize this change. And it's really important that we should converge, cooperate, engage. And like when I hear, Rosamond, you're saying about how Black Lives Matter has branched into many, it's inspiring to hear that. I think this is the need of the hour. And in India too, I mean, even before Manipur became a part of India in 1904, 116 years ago, Manipuri women fought British colonial rule using non-violent techniques, because Manipuri women knew that British men, soldiers, don't touch their bodies. So they formed a body of wall and prevented British military from forcibly recruiting labor without payment. And they negotiated, you see. So we have a 116-year-old women's resistance. I am a byproduct of that resistance. And then in 1939, the Manipuri women again fought against British colonial rule for creating artificial food scarcity, because they were siphoning off rice from my region to sell off to other parts of the world. So women again form a resistance. We have the world's only women's market, largest women in my region, where 5,000 women sell rice, bangle, the clothes that I'm wearing, they weave. You know, it's an amazing culture of resistance. And when insurgencies started, they formed what is called women with bamboo torches, who patrol to reclaim the streets of Manipur at night. In other parts of India, women's resistance started very strongly in 1970s, and it's continuing till today. And then it galvanized with the Delhi gang rape, if you remember, in 2012.
Absolutely.
I was there in Delhi at the time. It was one of the most amazing movements I've ever seen in my life, which I have not seen women's movement united across. And currently, with the rise of Modi government, the kind of resistance we are seeing in Shaheen Bagh and in Northeast Delhi and other parts of Delhi that we are seeing is remarkable. We have been now telling, like, let's learn from these strategies. And again, the best part of this, I'm not saying that all women are peaceful and that all movements are peaceful, but yes, women of India, indigenous women of the Northeast, Assam, Manipur, Tripura, Nagaland, we have shown that you cannot pierce a non-violent movement with a weapon. And this is what authoritarian regimes fear.
Right.
And we're going to keep pushing that.
Right.
Yeah,
And the
yeah.
incredible
Yeah.
leadership across the country of women in every place, including
Absolutely.
universities, the
Yes.
Shaheen Bagh, all these
Yes.
places that women are really up in
Yes.
the front.
Yes.
And what I've noticed in the Indian media is
Yeah.
the media is kind of taken aback a little bit and saying, wow, women are really leading
Exactly.
this, you know? And,
Yeah, yeah.
and I have to say, as someone who grew up in India and came to the US, it's just so exciting to see them standing up there and,
Yes.
you know, and really leading that
Yes.
chant. I know in Brazil, the indigenous women had that march, and then they also, that huge march that happened a few months ago.
Yes, now the indigenous women and indigenous communities in general have denounced this government in Brazil, you know, with several protests and also internationally. And the situation in Brazil is so dramatic now that we do need to build international solidarity as well, because there is also a lot of repression against any type of protest. You know, since Bolsonaro took power, dozens of indigenous peoples and peasants have been killed as well. So it's also dangerous to protest right now. But during his campaign, the most important movement during the campaign was the Ele Não, which is not him campaign, which started as a hashtag. And in 1 week, there were like 4 million women on a Facebook group, you know, putting out this information against Bolsonaro, Ele Não. And that continues on social media, and there was also a very large march before the election. So, you know, the other country, because former President Lula was in jail and was not able to run, although he was the most popular politician at that time, the other candidate that was supported by Lula had just 40 days to campaign, and he got 44 million votes, right? Bolsonaro got 55 million votes. So it's not like, you know, there is resistance as well. For example, all the northeast part of the country voted against Bolsonaro. And there is a lot of resistance also between, you have this divide between the South and the North. The South being, you know, more white, more middle class, and the North being more indigenous, and having this history of resistance. And so also the oil workers have been on strike for 3 weeks right now, and nobody's talking about that. There are nothing in the Brazilian media, and because Bolsonaro wants to privatize this key company, you know, they are dismantling all types of institutions in Brazil, you know, the industry, education. So what kind of future we're going to have if we don't preserve our natural resources? Once you privatize the national oil company, then you open space for several multinational corporations to exploit the oil, and the risk of a huge disaster would be bigger, which we have been seeing already, you know, oil spills in the most beautiful beaches in the Northeast. So it's a combination of dismantling all kinds of possibilities for a better future, you know, possibilities for employment, for national industries, for education, for a healthy environment. For example, he allowed more than 300 new pesticides since he got elected.
Oh my God.
And Brazil already is the country that consumes most pesticides in the world, so it's a kind of chemical weapon, you know.
Oh my God.
And so to dismantle small farmers, to get rid of organic, ecological agriculture. So we need to fight in so many fronts, and the repression, the risk of repression also is very high. So that's why I think we need to build international solidarity, especially here in the US. For example, the indigenous movements are calling for a boycott of 4 main commodities from Brazil. That are the main reason for the destruction of the Amazon: beef, soy, timber, and sugar, because these are the main things that agribusiness produces, undermining the production of food for local markets. So did something we can call our representatives here in the U.S., to call for a boycott. When we talk about the Green New Deal, how can we incorporate the international perspective in the new Green Deal and the role of U.S. corporations abroad? Because they have a nationalist discourse, but they are opening up the country, for multinational corporations, mining, oil.
It's the same playbill.
Yeah,
In
exactly.
all three places, right? It's like the same playbill. And in terms of international solidarity, one of the things that I wanted to just bring up is that this Modi-Trump bromance has really gotten high, and one of the things it's doing is getting a lot of Indian Americans here who were anti-Trump the last time around, now supporting Trump because they think he might be good for India. And Indians generally, Indian Americans in the US, a big portion of them are very wealthy. And so it's also a contribution to the Trump campaign. And I have to say, even my own relatives, who are now for Trump because Trump will be good for India, which was selling them how many $1 billion of armament. And but it would be interesting. I mean, I don't think we'll have time to do it now, but it would be interesting to actually write down the playbill. Write down like the opening up of oil, the timber. I mean, Trump's doing the same thing in the U.S.
And
it's
also to write down the resistance, because we can learn from each other for that too. And I'm so glad that you said the 4 things to boycott, because I think, everyone who's watching this has probably learned at least one thing, right? Because there are probably nobody who knows about all of the countries who we've mentioned. And I think people need to educate themselves, right? About what they know, about places that they don't know, and also about where they can support and where they can join into the resistance. And also looking at responsible media and making sure that when you post things on social media, that it is from a reputable source.
So a couple of things which I wanted to share was this, resistance has to be reclaimed. And it's so important that this resistance is intersectional, like beyond nations, because this playbook is being played all over the world. And research is being done, but this research has to be seen for many of us that it's impacting lives on the ground. And the right wing are connecting they are all hugging each other, they're like coordinating each other because of the global finance industry, they are all connected, and then because of religion too, there is connected. And the diaspora is becoming an important role of how this is funding authoritarian regimes back home also, because it gives them this machoistic feeling that, oh, we love our country, and let everything else go somewhere else, so kind of thing. So we really have to, here is a serious point, documenting, sharing, researching, plus galvanizing our support. Our movements has to go beyond projects. Our movements cannot be just project funded. We cannot have these kind of important work. That's why I've been advocating for a long time. Global North, Global South, still divide is there in movement. We have to listen to each other. We have to inform each other, and we have to ensure that it has to be intersectional. We have to share our resources, because there's so much resource. How much, as an activist, we've been doing work for 15 long years of my life. I didn't want to be an activist. I wanted to be a physicist. But the amount of repression, violence, and human rights violations has turned me into the person that I am now. And it's not ending. It's becoming worse now. So I think it's really important that we need a new kind of resistance, which has to go beyond our boxes, our silos, as feminists, as Dalit movement, as LGBTQ communities, as people who are across different indigenous groups. So I think, and women's groups, we have to find new ways of activism. What is it? I'm still searching.
I just want to tell one short story, because also when Bolsonaro came to talk to Trump, he ended a long history of reciprocity in Brazilian diplomacy. So because Brazilians need a visa to come here, US people used to need a visa to go to Brazil, and that was an important source of funding for the Brazilian diplomacy. So Bolsonaro said, no, US people don't need a visa anymore to go to Brazil. And what happened? Now more and more Brazilians are being deported under Trump with the support of Bolsonaro. And Bolsonaro is saying, I will help you deport Brazilians and I will help funding the deportations of Brazilians. And those are people who voted from here, you know, who vote, Brazilians living in the US, who voted for Bolsonaro because they were influenced by mainstream media from Brazil. So, you know, and now they're being deported. So just an advice for Indian people living in the US.
Be careful.
Be careful.
Yeah, that's a very good advice.
Yeah.
Because
Absolutely.
they are, in fact, people who did the PR for Modi, they studied in Harvard.
Yep.
They were young people who are fueling the image of, in India we have a term called Maya. It means illusion. So when Modi, before he became to power, what I saw in New Delhi was Modi was staring from post office, from bus stations, from train stations. He was all over before he even became a prime minister. So it was this huge PR image building. And look at his Twitter account, look at his Facebook page. So again, nowadays, on one hand, that imagery is increasing. And then on the other hand, we can't even tweet, we can't even put a Facebook post critiquing any of its policies. One journalist from Manipur was put under national security detention for a year because he criticized the Indian current ruling party's policies. So I think these are the things that we have. The attacks on women and indigenous human rights defenders is a very critical thing. In India, the death of Gauri Lankesh still pains us.
A journalist who was killed.
She was killed in 2017. 5 people are detained. One of the finest activists of India are detained on charges currently for aiding, left-wing extremism in India and all of that. So again, false charges put. All colonial sedition laws are put, which are like 200 years old from British times, are pulled up. And people are put under sedition charges, colonial acts like the armed forces. So all of these are again playbook of which are really important.
And I think one point that you bring up that is true in all these places is the role of technology and how it's really changed the way we think about democracy, right? I mean, we have a president in the United States who rules by Twitter. Right? I mean, he does. Whenever he thinks of something, he's tweeting, and then everyone sort of jumps up. I mean, and it's true in Brazil. And one is that the rule by Twitter, but also the taking away of, like in Kashmir, the fact that the internet was shut down was that you couldn't, the control over people's ability to communicate is also so precarious, right? I mean, it's precarious on both sides. And so, you have people organizing and saying, me here, and then suddenly it's just gone. So I think we also need to, in terms of the resistance, we need to think of the role of the kind of technology and media in terms of what it does in terms of the ruling party, but then also how it can be controlled in terms of the resistance. And, false media, it's fake media, it's like all of that. So we're starting to come to a close. And so I want to give each of you about a minute and a half to just sort of say what your closing thoughts are. And I will start with you on my furthest left.
Well, I want to end by giving an example from the Caribbean. And this is, it's a long story, but basically there was a young woman who spoke out against sexual abuse in a rural community in Jamaica. And older women in that community went to confront, it was a minister that she had accused of raping her. And they took with them tambourines, and they became the tambourine army. And so this to me is related to you talking about some of your foremothers who weren't necessarily educated women, they weren't necessarily professional activists, and yet they are still making a huge difference in their community. So just as we need the Twitter activism and we need the technology base, we can't forget that actually standing next to people and being in human support is also really important.
Right, 1 minute.
Yes, my take is on nonviolent resistance. However much the world may think violence is a key and guns are powerful, for us it's not. non-violence, massive non-violence form of resistance is going to be a key to topple these authoritarian regimes. Martin Luther King tested it. Independence of India was won without firing a single bullet, and I still believe in Gandhi, I believe in Luther, and I believe in all the mothers, our sisters, our communities who have fought non-violently against this regime. We have to continue this resistance. The only thing is we have to do it smartly, using technology, because the authoritarian regimes have a playbook. They're connecting, they are hugging. We got to innovate new ways of doing this. So this is something which I'm going to incubate in the next few months and years with all of us.
Yeah, I think the role of culture and arts is very important, and that's something that is also under attack in Brazil. And now it's Carnival there, and there is so much street protest. I forgot to say, to mention that. So important how people are protesting, you know, using Carnival, using music, using culture, grassroots culture, organizing. So I think it's very important to preserve that, the role of arts and the role of culture in local communities as well as, you know, famous artists that have been also speaking out. So how can we organize around that as well? Whoever has visibility and can speak to the world also has an important role.
Absolutely. And I would say, I think in closing, is these multinational conversations about these places are really critical, because it's, we you know, wherever you're organizing, you know that issue really well. But a conversation like this really tells us the playbook, right? What's their playbook? And also then what solidarity do we do? As you said, how do we organize amongst each other and support each other? And not have it only be the people from here voting for the right-wing governments there or the right-wing governments here, but really how do we do more solidarity work and feminist solidarity and feminist resistance. And I agree, I think that as the feminist movement, we need to understand that we're very critical right now. And how do we come together and not be in our global north, global south, whatever, black, white, Latino, you know, it's like we're all in these little silos. But at this moment, those guys don't seem to, they're hugging. Yep. And so we need to figure out how we start hugging in a different way. Because there's one thing that I always think of, and I come back to it, there are just so many more of us than them. And I think we need to really think about how do we use our power and our resistance to really change the world, because the world really does need to have something happen, because we're not in a great place in most parts of the world. So on that, I will close the show. Happy International Women's Day, and keep up the resistance.
Thank you.